Well, shooters and reloaders out there and Three Circles patrons, welcome. And today we're going to do a video about the Lyman Reloading Manual. Well, why do I bring this up? And it's because the 51st edition of the Lyman Reloading Manual has just come out. 2022, 51st edition. And so to kind of celebrate, I went ahead and got the hardbound edition instead of the softbound, which is one I always get. Well, if you don't have a Lyman Reloading Manual, then the 51st edition is the one you want to get. Have the 50th edition or the 49th edition, then do you need to buy the 51st? And I hope to be able to answer that question for you by the end of this video. So it turns out that Lyman's been making all these manuals for so many years, going way back like over 100 years, maybe even more like 120, 130 years. So a lot of you out there remember this one. This is the 45th edition, which is only like 6 editions back, but this came out in 1970, the same time that I was doing some varmint hunting out in Williams and Weed, California, and we used this volume to serve as our reloading manual. I remember seeing one of Hickok 45's videos where he talks about reloading and he used this manual. So a lot of you out there have it. This came out in 1970. Turns out that the 49th edition came out in the year 2008. So between the 1970 edition of the 45th and the 49th edition, there were 3 editions that spanned those 38 years between these two. So it's not set how long it goes before Lyman puts out the next edition. It might go 12 or 13 years before the next edition comes out. Depends on the staff at Lyman. So this one came out in 2008, and then the 50th edition actually came out in the year 2016. So 8 years went by before the next edition came out. And then now the 51st edition took 6 more years before this one came out. Now notice the smaller format of the 45th edition and previous to that. And the advantage of the smaller edition is that this fit on our reloading bench very nicely so that we could use it right there on the bench. And how things have changed. Only a limited number of powders available back in 1970. Now we have a lot more powders. So the advantage of the smaller format, right there on the bench we can have our information. In the 46th edition that came out in 1982, they went to the larger format. And this is nice because the larger format allows for a lot more data and there's a lot more components, so that's nice. But you can't just put this on your reloading bench, it's too big. Now a very subtle change. The 45th edition had this font for Lyman logo. Starting with the 46th edition, not only did they go to a larger format, but they changed the font. Notice the Lyman now has a little tail on the Y, and they went to a more cursive A. But that's the Lyman logo that has gone forth from then till now. Now all the Lyman manuals have the why and a how of reloading articles to begin the manual. But there's also some articles of interest, and in the past there's always been some real nice articles of interest, such as from authors such as Brian Pierce, who writes some real interesting articles on guns and reloading. So I remember in some of the manuals of the past, very interesting articles on the history of bullets and this kind of thing. But in the 50th edition has a nice history on the manuals themselves through the years and how Lyman actually got the data for the reloading to publish in the book. They had to do a lot of load testing, and some of the chapters here speak of the details on the load development. So that was very interesting in the 50th edition. Now I'm sorry to report that in the 51st edition there are no new articles. Basically, they took all the previous articles from the 50th edition and put them in the 51st. The only difference is there's an article of interest on tips on using the progressive reloading presses. But the problem with that article is it really talks about the Lyman 10 station progressive press in specific. And if you have any other type of progressive press, which is what we have, like Dillon's and Lee's and all that kind of thing, the tips don't really apply very well to our reloading presses that are not Lyman. That article basically was a non-factor, and I don't think very many of us will find it very interesting and probably even skip it after you read the first 3 or 4 paragraphs. So this issue has some nice data in it, of course, has some new calibers like the 224 Valkyrie, that kind of thing. But if you don't have those new calibers, this one hasn't got anything different than the 50th anniversary edition. I would say that those of you out there who have the 50th edition or 49th edition, no need to buy the 51st. You can wait until the next one comes out or one after that and catch up at that point. And because of that, buying the hardbound edition like I did was basically a waste of resources. A few of them. Now I do have some problems with specific recommendations in this manual. For example, 4 or 5 times it says in this manual that only use new brass to do your reloads, or brass from ammunition that you purchased factory and then go ahead and reload that. But it's not hard to identify brass at the range that's really once fighter factory brass. If you see some of the many shooters out there that are new shooters, they bring factory ammo and they shoot it and they throw the box away that's empty and all their brass is on the ground, and you can reckon brass that you pick up at the range is like Remington and Winchester and all your good Fiocchis and all of that brass, PMC, you name it, is all good brass, and we can recognize good brass just by looking at it. So free brass is something that we really should take advantage of. Now, of course, if you see brass that's all beat up, or perhaps the head area is all swollen by being fired in Glocks and this kind of thing, well, we can pass on that kind of brass. So we can identify good brass from bad brass. And if you can't identify good brass from bad brass, then by all means go with the recommendation that Lyman gives you to only use your own brass or brand new brass. Now, I always go to the bullet casting section to see if there's anything new in there, and there isn't. But one of the cautions in this manual on bullet casting is not to allow even 1 drop of water to fall into your casting pot, because a lead explosion will happen. Well, as you know, that's an old wives' tale that we've disproved on several occasions now. It's that water that gets under the surface that turns into steam, and that steam becomes a steam bubble underneath the surface that drives the molten lead out of the pot. That's where your lead explosion comes from. So here's the problem. Suppose you have some range scrap that has some water trapped inside one of the bullet jackets, and you can't see that water. Or suppose you have one of your trusty ingots, but you didn't notice that there happens to be a contraction pucker. But you didn't notice that there happens to be a contraction pucker on the base of it, and some water condensed and got in there, so that there's actually water trapped inside that little cavity in there. Now you take that ingot and you plop it into molten lead. Suppose you got a lot of molten lead in there and you plop it in there. Well, the funny thing about that ingot is it'll sink right down to the bottom, and the heat of the molten lead will start to melt that ingot right away. But also, that water will be turning to steam. And when it turns to steam, it's building up a steam bubble that's rapidly expanding in size underneath the surface of the molten lead. What will happen is that steam bubble will just drive the entire amount of molten lead right out of the pot like a mortar. And that expanding steam bubble will make a big explosion sound when it breaks the surface, like a gunshot. And it takes about 3 or 4 seconds for that to happen. The caster will have a disaster and then thinks back and says, I don't understand how it happened. I kept all the water out of there. But then someone's going to say, well, a drop of sweat must have come off your brow and fell in there, and that's when it exploded. And then that old wives' tale keeps getting propagated. And no one learns anything. The other problem is that if you take a spoon or a ladle or some kind of tool that's flat metal, and maybe there's condensation on that side, and then you put it on your molten lead, and that water is trapped between the molten lead and the ladle, it can't vent to the atmosphere. So when that turns to steam, it makes the lead flow back toward the operator with a big splatter. And then the old wives' tale is, oh, I had a cold spatula, and when I touched the hot lead with it, it caused the splatter, it caused a little mini explosion. Well, it was water again that caused the problem. So again, you propagate old wives' tales and no one learns anything. Now, of course, I regard Lyman very highly. They've been with us for 150 years, helping out shooters and bullet casters and reloaders. The best recommendation is to have more than one reloading manual. And there are several that we can easily recommend, including Lyman, but also the Lee Reloading Manual, the Hornady, the Spear, the Hodgdon Reloading Manual. So many, and they're all very good. Well, shooters and reloaders, take care. We'll see you next video. There's my 3040 Krag in the Lyman Manual. We're going to get busy and do some reloading. Bye for now.